When we picture a battlefield, we imagine the greatest threat is the enemy across the line aiming a rifle at us. But historically, the men in uniform have rarely been the most lethal force on the field. The environment they march into usually gets them first. In June of 1812, Napoleon marched into Russia with over 600,000 men. It was the largest army Europe had ever produced, setting out to crush the Tsar's forces. But the Russians refused to give Napoleon the decisive set-piece battle he wanted. Instead, they constantly retreated, burning their own crops and villages to ash as they went. Long before a single snowflake fell, Napoleon's men were already dying by the thousands from starvation and typhus. Then the Russian winter arrived, dropping temperatures to near 30 degrees below zero. Soldiers ate their own dead horses, then fought each other over the remains. Men whose uniforms had disintegrated wrapped themselves in stolen rugs and curtains, shuffling through the snow until they froze upright exactly where they sat. Out of the 600,000 men who marched in, only a shattered fraction ever stumbled back out. The grandest military force in European history was decimated without fighting a single major battle, erased by the slow, inescapable forces of extreme weather and disease. 50 years. If a bullet shattered your arm or leg, the standard treatment was rapid amputation. Surgeons who had never heard of germs wiped their saws on their aprons and got right back to cutting, often with barely any anesthesia. This chart tracks the true toll of the conflict. Of the roughly 620,000 American soldiers who died in the Civil War, 2/3 of them were killed by camp diseases. Illnesses like typhoid, dysentery, and measles tore through dense encampments, where the latrine cave often sat just a few feet away from the cooking fires. A soldier could survive the relentless artillery fire of Gettysburg or Antietam, the worst battles in American history, only to die in his own tent weeks later from a bad drink of water. If you were taken prisoner, the biological threat multiplied. At the Andersonville Confederate prison camp, 45,000 Union troops were packed into 26 bare acres. With a single stream functioning as both the drinking water supply and the open sewer, disease killed nearly 100 men every single day during the worst months of the camp. For the pre-industrial soldier, warfare was a biological lottery. Packing thousands of exhausted, hungry men into highly concentrated, unsanitary environments created perfect delivery systems for plague. As the 20th century arrived, rapid advancements in technology failed to make war cleaner. Instead, industrialization engineered mechanized, inescapable environments specifically designed to break the human mind. Millions of men on the Western Front spent years living in muddy ditches carved across France and Belgium. Soldiers stood in freezing water for weeks, causing their feet to rot inside their boots. Rats grew fat feeding on the dead, while lice infested every layer of clothing. Above the mud, artillery shells fell day and night for years. You couldn't fight back, and you couldn't see the shells coming. You just sat in the dirt and hoped. That absolute helplessness birthed shell shock, leaving soldiers trembling, unable to speak, and staring at nothing. In 1915, a new horror arrived. Clouds of chlorine and mustard gas drifted over the trenches, burning the eyes, skin, and lungs of anyone caught without a mask. Decades later, the Iran-Iraq War escalated this. Over 8 years of brutal trench fighting in the 1980s, soldiers faced modern chemical weapons, including the first battlefield use of nerve agents. One moment the air felt fine, and the next, a man was thrown into a violent, fatal seizure. Industrial warfare shifted the ultimate horror from physical death to total psychological destruction via constant, unseen threats. In the jungles of Vietnam, the environment itself was rigged to kill and maim. American troops were forced to navigate terrain that the Viet Cong had deliberately weaponized. The ground beneath a soldier's boots hid tripwires, buried mines, and camouflaged punji pits filled with sharpened bamboo stakes smeared in filth to guarantee infection. Even discarded items left on the trail as souvenirs were routinely rigged with explosives. The tactical logic was cruel and calculated. Traps were designed to injure because a wounded soldier stops a patrol for hours. His unit has to carry him, protect him, and call in an evacuation, paralyzing the mission. Roughly 11% of American deaths came from booby traps and mines, turning every step into a coin flip. The constant anticipation of an invisible threat permanently fractured a soldier's ability to trust the very ground they walked on. In November 1950, UN troops at the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea found themselves completely surrounded by Chinese forces, fighting off human wave attacks as the temperature plummeted to 35 degrees below zero. The cold became its own enemy. Rifles jammed, medics had to thaw morphine in their own mouths, and rations froze so hard men chipped their teeth trying to eat them. Mid-battle, the sweat from fighting would instantly freeze against a soldier's skin. The ultimate nightmare occurred on the Eastern Front of World War II. In the bombed-out ruins of Stalingrad, the Germans named the bitter close-quarters combat the Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. Ordinary soldiers were fed into a meat grinder. They fought room to room and floor to floor while starving, shivering in summer uniforms because their leadership's hubris promised a quick victory before the Russian snows fell. This was a war of annihilation. Soldiers were trapped between a merciless enemy in front and the cold indifference of their own regimes behind them. On the Eastern Front, surviving the crossfire and laying down your weapon offered no salvation. When the German Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad, roughly 91,000 men marched into Soviet captivity. As the graphic shows, that mass of prisoners collapses down to a tiny cluster of barely 6,000 men who actually lived long enough to return home. On the Soviet side, the data is even larger. Of the nearly 6 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany during the war, this drop-off represents the roughly 3 million who died in captivity from starvation, disease, and execution. This was the reality of the march, endless columns of broken, freezing men moving over icy roads directly into their own mass graves. The world we inhabit today stands in stark contrast to the lives of these men, the 23-year-olds in the jungle or the 17th century mercenaries who were born and died in military camps without ever knowing peace. Honoring those generations requires us to look past the victory dates and the casualty counts to see the visceral, freezing reality of what they were forced to endure.